Thanks everyone again for joining us. We are delighted to have you join us for this 45-minute session on the OECD Due Diligence Guidance, some linkages to the LME Responsible Sourcing Program, and of course to ASI's current standards revision. I'm Fiona, the CEO at ASI, and my co-presenter today is Camille, our ASI Learning Manager.
Hi everyone.
So, thanks, Camille. So we'll first aim to spend about 10 or 15 minutes sharing some introductory information for the session. So this will include the LME Responsible Sourcing requirements and their Track A standards. We'll talk a little bit about the ASI Performance Standard alignment work with the OECD guidance. We'll look at the focus of due diligence under this guidance and what we mean by risks associated or related to conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And finally, Camille will talk about the OECD 5-step framework itself and how it's applied to the aluminium value chain. So that's the upfront part of the session, and we want to make sure we've got plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So we do want this session to be interactive, and so here's how you can ask a question in a Zoom webinar. So to post a question, you open the Q&A window, you type in your question and you click send, and you can ask it anonymously if you prefer. So those questions come into us as presenters, so just because you can't see any, don't think that no one's asking anything. We do really want to hear from you. So we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can, either answering them live in the discussion time with Camille and I, or through a written response to the Q&A box. And remember, you can be posting questions as we go along, so you don't need to wait for the discussion time to start. So let's start first with the London Metal Exchange, or the LME, and their responsible sourcing requirements and what ASI's role is within that. So LME finalised their new rules on this in October 2019, and they're framed around rolling out the OECD due diligence guidance to a broader range of metals than has historically been done. So initially, OECD's focus when they developed their guidance was on what's called 3TG, or tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, and particularly in relation to issues in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I was actually closely involved with that work when I was working on standards in the gold and jewellery industry. However, OECD subsequently clarified and updated its due diligence guidance to be applicable to all minerals and metals. So LME have taken this on board, and their new rules effectively apply to LME brands, and aluminium is of course an LME commodity. So ASI agreed to support LME on this to align with the OECD due diligence guidance and become what's called a Track A standard under LME. And we're doing that work as part of the current standards revision that we're heavily involved in. And so the new version of the ASI Performance Standard is being updated to enable LME brands to meet LME's rules. So this figure, which is LME's, is essentially saying that in this triangle up the top there, that the OECD guidance has global consensus as a framework for responsible sourcing from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The second layer is saying that standards like ASI can effectively be tools for implementing the OECD guidance and tailoring it to specific commodity supply chains, like in our case, aluminium. And finally, at the bottom, that LME brands can use these standards to demonstrate compliance with the guidance and with LME's rules via an audit process. So on the right, you can see that there are 3 tracks for meeting LME's requirements. Track A is where ASI fits. You'll see it shows that ASI needs to go and undergo an alignment assessment to demonstrate that we are in lockstep with OECD. There's also 2 other non-ASI tracks that LME offers, the B and the C tracks, which they will oversee, and ASI is not involved in those. So what are the timelines for LME's rollout? So this slide shows Track A, which is where ASI fits, in that left-hand column. So ASI needs to complete its alignment assessment by the end of 2022 in order to be recognised as a Track A standard by LME. And then LME brands that want to use ASI as a Track A option then have until the end of 2023 to be audited against the new version of the ASI Performance Standard. So if you're an LME brand, according to LME's rules, you need to decide by June 2022 which track you're going to use. Tracks B and C, you can kind of see in that table, involve submitting audit results or a red flag assessment by June 2022. But if you plan to do Track A, like through ASI, you simply need to confirm to LME that that's your plan by June 2022. So how are ASI's timeframes lining up with this? Well, we've commenced the OECD alignment assessment this month and plan to have the process completed by LME's December 2022 deadline. It's not a cheap or a fast process, unfortunately. It involves an independent assessment team, but we have got that underway. And we've framed the assessment to work around our standards revision and consultation processes. At this stage, we aim to finalise the standards revision in around May 2022. And so that's 7 months ahead of LME's deadline for us to be a Track A. And it's 19 months ahead of LME's deadline for its listed brands to be audited against that standard. So what's changing in the ASI Performance Standard? Well, we already had a criterion on conflict affected and high risk areas, and that was criterion 9.8, and it's got the same numbering in the new draft revisions that we've published. So the updates in the Performance Standard and the accompanying guidance are basically to more tightly align this with the OECD guidance. They're 5 steps of due diligence, and you can see them set out on the screen there. The alignment assessment, which is what we need to meet to be recognised by not just LME, but also OECD itself as an implementation standard, it takes a really prescriptive view of the OECD guidance. So our redrafting of this criteria and the supporting guidance has been designed to fully meet those expectations, and they're actually set out in an OECD alignment assessment tool that will be used by the independent assessors, and which, if you're interested, you can find on the OECD website. So the drafting work that we've done is to adapt the OECD guidance to the specificities of the aluminium value chain. Currently, there are detailed OECD guidance supplements for 3T, so for tin, tungsten and tantalum, treated together as kind of one common-ish commodity group, and another one for gold. There isn't one for aluminium. So ASI has essentially done that work as part of our standards revision, and we've sought feedback through our public consultation recently, and of course we'll again through the next round of public consultation. So you might ask, if this is for LME, why are all members going to be required to do it and not just LME brands? Well, there's a few reasons. First, it's extremely difficult in practice for a single actor, for example, a smelter, to unilaterally carry out this work without broader engagement in supply chains. So second, and for exactly that reason, the OECD guidance has specific recommendations for upstream and downstream entities of all kinds to implement due diligence. Third, the alignment assessments for other programs, such as in the 3TG space, have found fault where programs limit their scope or don't apply across the membership. So we have deliberately and understandably taken a comprehensive approach. Finally, and probably most importantly, this kind of due diligence is a growing expectation and becoming part of various regulatory efforts, including EU conflict minerals legislation. So while that kind of legislation doesn't currently apply to bauxite or aluminium, we can pretty much expect that to come. And so it's really important that the ASI and the industry more broadly be proactive on this. So for all of these reasons, we are aligning our performance standard with the OECD guidance as it has been drafted. So I'm now going to hand over to Camille for some insights into some of the training that we have in development and the key OECD concepts. Thanks, Camille.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So ASI is developing a number of resources to support the implementation and the assessment of this new requirement. So first of all, extensive guidance has been drafted, as Fiona explained, which is like the OECD supplements. This will be available together with the rest of the revised standards and guidance mid-2022, but you can still access the draft for consultation that is still published on our website. We're also developing an online course on ASI Learning Platform Educational to support members in the implementation of this criterion. The course will guide you through the whole process. It also includes an FAQ, so if you have specific to that topic, so if you have any question, you can consult the FAQ, but of course, if the answer is not in there, you can contact us. Similarly, there will be a course for auditors, and this course will be mandatory as well as passing the related exam to become or to maintain your performance accreditation if you are already accredited. So this course will be made available in the first quarter of 2022, but we'll communicate that to the accredited firms and auditors in due course. We're also developing some country-specific modules that will allow you to better understand the local context of some countries. But this does not necessarily mean that the modules on those countries means those countries are conflict affected or high-risk areas. It is to provide with more context for you to assess that. So the first one is on Guinea and is currently being prepared by Dr. Penda Diallo. And lastly, we're extending the pool of registered specialists in mining locations that have appropriate knowledge and skills, in particular the local language, cultural awareness, to conduct on-the-ground assessments where that might be required as part of the due diligence process. So risk-based due diligence is a process that is already relevant for a number of criteria in the performance standard. Here, the specificity is that the due diligence is centered around identifying and assessing risks related to conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So those risks are defined in the Annex 2 of the OECD guidance, also in the performance standard guidance, and they are well explained in the online course. But in short, they relate to conflict, governance, human rights, and financial crimes. So we're talking about risks of serious human rights abuses like torture, forced labor, child labor, sexual violence, support to non-state armed groups that carry out illegal activities, support to public or private security forces that control or extort money from mine sites or transportation routes, bribery, money laundering, tax evasion. So the due diligence process is about assessing those risks and should not be limited to only a geographical scope, because a conflict-affected or high-risk area can be a region, a country, an area within a country, or even an area that crosses one or more national boundaries. So the companies that operate in or source minerals from those regions are not necessarily complicit in conflict. They can even play an important role in supporting livelihoods if this is supported by a solid due diligence process. On the other hand, corruption and bribery risks may happen at any point along the value chain and not necessarily in the countries that would be thought as CARAs in the first place. So that's why the due diligence process must be really centered around the risks associated with conflict-affected and high-risk areas. That's one of the reasons why ASI has not and will not predetermine any country as being a conflict-affected or high-risk areas and will not provide a list. All the resources we've mentioned, like the guidance or the online course, are here to provide you with the tools to assess yourself whether there are risks related to conflict-affected and high-risk areas in your supply chains. So the due diligence process that is outlined in the OECD guidance and required under this new criterion is divided into 5 steps. We'll go very briefly over them now, but they are very detailed in the guidance and also in the trainings. So first, it's about establishing strong management systems, information collection, controls over the supply chain. Step 2 is building on those strong management systems and the information you collected under the first step. It's to assess the risks associated with the bauxite, alumina, or primary aluminium you purchase through your supply chain by conducting a risk assessment. Then, if you have identified potential or actual risks that we call red flags, you will move on to step 3, which is to manage and mitigate the risks. But if you have not identified any risk, you can directly move on to step 4, which is to audit practices. So step 4 will be automatically rated as conformance for ASI because the third-party audit, which is the requirement, is happening with the normal ASI Performance Standard audits. And finally, the last steps is to annually publicly report on your due diligence practices. So before moving to the Q&A sessions, we wanted to answer a few questions that were raised in advance of the webinar. So the first one is there a tool similar to the Human Rights Compliance Assessment Quick Check, but based on the OECD guidance, thinking of SMEs? So apparently the Human Rights Compliance Assessment Quick Check is no longer available and has been superseded by the Human Rights Indicators for Business. This is a good resource to look at for support in implementing the criterion, but it does not cover the whole breadth of the ASI requirements. So for following only this wouldn't be enough. And about this, we actually reference another resource for SMEs in the training, which is the European Due Diligence Toolbox for SMEs that includes information, tools, training materials to guide companies in conducting due diligence. But pay attention because those materials are applicable also to other minerals, so some of them might not be relevant, especially when relating to artisanal mining, for example. The second question was, is there a way to require OECD due diligence from sub-suppliers, tier N companies, and not only from the certified entity? Fiona, maybe you want to answer that one?
So OECD due diligence is essentially a continuous process to raise awareness among suppliers and some suppliers. So if you're kind of thinking about what's some practical ways to roll that out through a supply chain, you can certainly contact your relevant suppliers, make sure they're aware of your CARA's policy, have a dialogue about, what that means, ask questions. There might be, depending on your size of your organization, if you're a larger organization and you're working with SMEs, looking to help build capacity amongst those suppliers. Where appropriate, working with suppliers and or customers to help them build their own due diligence strategies and systems. You can reference your CARA's policy in communications, in contracts, agreements, or other relevant documents. I think the important thing to understand is that this is not like a click of the fingers overnight process, and certainly having seen and been involved in it being rolled out in the gold industry, it takes time, and I think expectations, and we communicate this in our guidance, are such that it's an ongoing and reactive process, and it takes that time to start to build this. So it's really, like any other part of the ASI standard where you're building a new system, that you start through that step by step, and you just think practically about how you start to build that capacity over time, both within your own organisation and with those that you deal with as business partners. So Camille, we had another question as well as part of the registration, which was about how the measures or requirements from ASI and LME measure up or match up with the German supply chain legislation that's coming out. Finding it a little bit hard to see the bottom of this thing, and expected EU regulations.
Yes, so looks like the focus of the German supply chain law is broader than the OECD guidance, as it's not just about mining, and it also encompasses international laws on child and forced labor, worker and environmental protections, fair wages. On top of that, the applicability begins to larger companies and then gradually moves to smaller companies, while the OECD guidance is applicable to every entity in the supply chain, no matter its size. But this clearly shows that there are growing regulations and NGO focus on human rights due diligence. And regarding the European Union regulations more generally, the OECD guidance is the framework for the European Union conflict minerals regulations and any other national level implementation of that. Well, let's move to the Q&A session now. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So we've got a few questions that have been coming in. I've typed some responses to some, but we have a couple of others. There's a few questions about what does it mean to annually report on due diligence? Does it need to be public? What kind of detail? Will there be guidance on that? Certainly within the guidance that we've developed for this criteria, which we've already published in the consultation process, so you can find that on our website. We do set out what kind of information the OECD expects to see within that, and it will be different depending on what part of the supply chain you are involved with. So upstream, certainly from the mine through to the smelter, there's sort of more effort. You're closer to kind of the risks, if you like. If you're downstream from the smelter, you are really looking back to what smelters are in your supply chain and are they implementing due diligence. So the annual reporting is really talking about what sort of efforts have been made. If you haven't identified any risks, if you don't have major issues in the supply chain, that reporting can be necessarily quite brief. It could be something that's on your website, it could be integrated into other kinds of public or other sustainability reporting that you do. It might be that it's something that's shared with customers and suppliers, but we have answers to that sort of questions in the guidance. There's also another question that's come through around being recyclers. So our supply chain relies on scrap from a large variety of sources. The important thing to understand is that the OECD due diligence guidance is really focusing on mineral extraction, ore extraction, and the risks of the kinds of risks that Camille went into. So if you do not source any primary aluminium, if you're a recycler and you only source scrap, then this guidance does not apply to you. If you, however, source small amounts of primary, then you have to be looking at where you're getting from and applying that due diligence towards that smelter. So it's simply understanding, I buy primary from smelters A and B, and I've had a look to see that they are implementing this guidance either by being an LME brand or by asking them, in some other way. So you are demonstrating what efforts that you are making. So I'm just going to tick off some of these questions that we have addressed.
Yeah. Fiona, there was also a questions. So regarding if someone asked if the surveillance audit against the performance standard is supposed to take place in 2024, should they follow LME track B and C before 2024? And in this case, can they shift over track A afterwards?
That's certainly an option, and I think it would be something to discuss with LME. I imagine there's some flexibility to move between tracks. The other alternative, obviously, is that you could kind of bring forward a surveillance audit basically to meet the LME's timeframe. So if you're only kind of 6 months later and you want to kind of meet the LME's timeframes around, I think it's the December 2023, where they want to have tracks A, B, and C all kind of in, then that's an option as well. But in terms of when LME's deadlines need to be met, that's something to take up with that. In terms of ASI, there's certainly the flexibility to bring forward a surveillance or similar in order to meet any timeframes that you might have in mind. So there's another question too for about step 5 reporting. Is there guidance on what level of detail is expected for the annual reporting? I touched on this before, but just to kind of note that we do set that all out in the guidance. So each of these steps that Camille has just run through has some pretty lengthy guidance. I might say too long, but we're trying to kind of provide that information for exactly these kinds of questions and questions that we know that have come up for other sectors or that need to kind of be part of that aligning with what's in the general OECD guidance as well. So we've got a question too now about what the transition period is for application as a revised standard, a year or more. That's exactly right. We plan to have a year of overlap of both standards. So you have the opportunity to, in that year of transition period, to either stick with the current version or to move across to the new one. That can kind of depend on, precisely when your timing is for recertification. If we publish it 5 minutes before you're due, that may not be a practical matter, or it might be something that you're wanting to do for LME purposes. Basically, I can see the timing issue weighing most heavily, if you like, on those that are LME brands and also wanting to use track A through ASI to meet those obligations. There's a question now too about, will a supply chain involving non-OECD compliant primary inputs automatically be excluded from ASI certification? No. So the process that the ASI standard and indeed the OECD guidance implements is to kind of say, we're asking you to be responsible for due diligence. Everyone will, as I said before, won't instantly be kind of compliant with this guidance or have gone through the ASI new version of the standard or any of those things. And we also within ASI don't require ASI members to only trade with other ASI members. It's really up to you about what your due diligence processes are. Obviously, if you're sourcing from ASI certified members against the new version of the standard, that gives you the assurance that they're carrying out the due diligence in accordance with what we say in the standard and therefore in accordance with the guidance. If you're sourcing from others, you may be looking for other kinds of evidence about what sort of due diligence they're undertaking. Another question that's come in, can dross of any type entering an ASI entity be designated as ASI eligible pre-consumer scrap? So that's not really the focus of this webinar. So we're really talking about the OECD guidance, and scrap is actually excluded from the OECD guidance because it's not related to that original kind of extractive process, you know, from conflict affected and high risk areas. So if that's a topic that you're interested in, that's something that perhaps you can just send us an email about and we can try and respond at another time. So Camille,
Fiona,
you go.
yeah.
Yes, you go, Camille.
Yeah, I have another question for you here. If I discover that I'm sourcing from a CARA, a conflict affected or high risk area, what should I do?
So if you're sourcing from a conflict affected and high risk area, or a CARA, as sometimes it's made into an acronym, it doesn't mean necessarily that there are actually serious abuses going on in your supply chain. It could simply mean that there is risks of that happening and you need to make a little bit more effort to look for the presence of any of those kinds of impacts there. And that kind of falls under that step 2 process in the standard. So if you're a bauxite, engaged in bauxite mining or in alumina refining or in aluminium smelting, what that means is that you need to take a more in-depth review of the context of any locations that have been what's called red flagged, and the due diligence practices of any red flagged suppliers. So you're really looking at these locations that are red flagged or suppliers that are red flagged. You can request them to tell you about what their supply chain policy is, what sort of management systems they have in place to assess risks. There might be adverse impacts identified. You would agree perhaps on mitigation strategies and how they're going to move forward and to what kind of timing. There are various things that you can kind of put in place. So basically, finding a red flag is an escalation, you know, of the due diligence process. In some cases, you know, there may be a need to conduct some kind of on-the-ground assessment to understand exactly what those impacts are. And this is something that the OECD guidance is structured around, and there's details provided in ASI's guidance and training as well. If you are on the recycling side of things, but sourcing a little bit of primary, or you're downstream of the smelter, you know, manufacturer, incendification, whatever, your role is really to evaluate what sort of due diligence and risk mitigation practices of those aluminium smelters that have any red flag supply chains are, and review any on-the-ground assessment processes that they've conducted. If you find that adverse impacts have been identified through this process, then you need to implement the step 3 in the guidance, which is about responding to the risk, having a risk management strategy, and taking risk mitigation efforts. Now, all of these things sound pretty intense, but at this stage, the kinds of things that we're talking about where this has been implemented in the past in minerals and metals such as tin, tungsten, tantalum, or gold have been, for example, widespread, very serious human rights abuses in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. You know, it included things like, you know, extortion, fueling civil unrest through extortion of sort of mineral processing and trading and extraction. There was a lot of artisanal and small-scale mining involved. There was widespread rapes happening in some areas. These were the kinds of things that merit a really serious response to understand whether mining of a particular mineral is contributing or causing these serious adverse human rights abuses. So I don't, at this stage, expect this to be kind of a widespread issue or risk of kind of red flags, but these situations can be evolving in sort of high risk locations. And so that's something that we're exploring. For example, we're developing a module on Guinea initially, but also looking at other locations to explore a little bit what some of the risks and issues are on the ground, and to put them into a broader context. We're not kind of saying through that module whether this would be a CARA or not, because obviously we record some information at a fixed point in time that does not fix a situation on the ground. But we are, through these efforts, trying to kind of shed more light on what is on the ground risks in different kinds of locations, just to help people's own due diligence processes.
There's actually a question coming in regarding the conflict affected and high risk areas lists, which touches a bit on what you just said. Which CARA's list would ASI recommend as a reference?
Yeah, so there really isn't a CARA's list sort of for aluminium per se. There are, I think, some consultants who are developing some lists that are usually behind a bit of a paywall. We don't really know the quality of those or whether they are addressing a wide range of minerals and materials. As I say, most of the focus to date has been on things like tin, tungsten, tantalum, gold, cobalt to some extent, some things like mica, etc. So there are different things out there. I would say again, I think I typed in that answer that the OECD itself are not in favour of kinds of lists because they rely obviously on a particular lens about how close to the ground, what kinds of minerals we're talking about, how frequently they're updated, on whose authority they're sort of speaking, and so on. Within the guidance, we certainly have lists of sort of prima facie material that look to kind of whether it be financial crime risks, whether it be other kinds of human rights risks, indices, and so on that can be drawn on. But at this stage, ASI has no plans to have its own list and can't point to one in the public domain that's relevant for, say, bauxite and aluminium. So Camille, maybe just a question for you, and I might be jumping around, but when you have a lot of suppliers and several tiers in the supply chain, how can you practically map the supply chain?
So you might not be able to map your entire supply chain within the first year of conducting the due diligence, but you are expected to work towards this goal. So what's important is continuous improvement, and that's also what is assessed by the auditor. So a risk-based approach could kick off with your riskiest suppliers and your critical suppliers. So the riskiest suppliers are those are already or are more likely to be sourcing for conflict-affected and high-risk areas, or they might come up in your risk assessment and red flags you identify. And your critical suppliers are the ones that are the most interconnected with other suppliers in the supply chain, so you will have more impact if you work closely with them.
So we have a question that's come in through the chat box again. So the question is, if even OECD does not want to define CARAs, how seriously can companies be requested to define CARA for themselves? Well, I guess this is the kind of principle of the due diligence, is that companies are expected to become more familiar with their supply chains, to understand where those risks lies, and that burden falls most deeply, if you like, with the primary production piece. So if you're engaged in bauxite mining, aluminum refining, and aluminium smelting, then there is an expectation that you understand those supply chains and that you're aware of those risks and that you're working with business partners to mitigate them where necessary. If you're downstream of that, if you are past the smelter, then your focus is on understanding where are the smelters that you're getting this from, and are they doing that heavy lifting? Are they doing that work upstream as a primary producer to keep an eye out for and manage and mitigate those risks? So that's why OECD is expecting and differentiating. So they are expecting companies to become more familiar with supply chains, but they're differentiating those responsibilities. So they've really defined sort of the metal production point as a kind of a choke point in the supply chain. So in theory, the smelter can look upstream to bauxite production areas and have I think we're all aware where risk areas are, or where, first of all, where bauxite's being produced, and keep abreast through industry and trade media and so on about issues that may be emerging. And if you're downstream, understanding what smelters are in your supply chain and how proactive they are in being those issues, that's your responsibility for when you're downstream. So there's another question about ISO 2400. I'm not actually familiar with that one. Is it recognised for meeting this criteria? Certainly not by ASI. We're not planning to recognise any particular ISO standard, but it might be worth mentioning that LME certainly were looking at, as part of their responsible sourcing rules, ISO 14000 for environmental management system, and OSHAS, or I can't remember the number, is it ISO 25,000 or 50, anyway, whatever, for the health and safety side. So while ASI standards certainly cover those topics, we don't see ourselves as fully equivalent to those two ISO standards. So if you're an LME brand and LME wants you to do those pieces as well, then that's the case. We certainly did do a review last year of sort of ASI smelters that were also LME brands that were ASI certified, and the majority at the time were also certified for ISO 14000, so we don't see a big gap there. The OSHAS side might be an extra piece, but again, that's coming from LME and not from ASI, so something to kind of discuss with them. There's a question, Winfried, I know you're very persistent on this question. Could ASI at least offer a list of candidate CARAs to be assessed by companies? I don't think so. That's effectively still a list. As I mentioned, we are developing a module on Guinea and possibly in other places just to provide information about what risk issues may be in those places. But again, it's, I think, something that is incumbent through the guidance for companies to kind of do those due diligence processes and to understand that. So question 2, a lot of focus on the list question, and I recall many, many hours of discussion on this under 3TG within the OECD forum as well. So the question is, as there might be different perspectives or lists on the CARA from different entities along the process chain, are the results comparable? Well, this is an interesting one, and I think what we can expect to see under LME, obviously they've got the 3 tracks. ASI's focus is on process, that companies are kind of doing the 5 steps. The 2 other LME tracks B and C, one is an audit, I guess a bit similar to ASI. I'm not familiar with how that's going to be developed, but there's also the option of a simply filling out a red flagged assessment template that LME has developed, and I'm pretty sure is available on their website. So that takes through the questions that are in the OECD guidance about either red flags in relation to locations or to suppliers. And so you just simply fill out a kind of a questionnaire that talks about what countries you get your bauxite from, whether suppliers have any red flags according to certain criteria, and then that's submitted. And that will provide, I imagine an LME the opportunity to kind of look at that data and see, well, we're seeing some companies, some brands that are kind of seeing these as red flags and others that are not. So we might see a kind of a case law, if you like, developed through that process. Within ASI, our focus is really on implementing and developing those due diligence systems.
Fiona, I have another question for you. Regarding SMEs, what is expected of them, and are the expectations during audits adapted to the size of the company?
Yeah, so as I sort of said, this is really a new area of work and effort for the whole aluminium sector, but it is that international expectation for mineral supply chains, and most recently LME. So downstream users will be looking at supply chains and supply chain due diligence as an accepted tool to manage these risks that are already in place for other metals. So it's important that aluminium not lag behind, other commodities. In terms of for SMEs in particular, the nature and extent of due diligence that's appropriate for a company always depends on the individual circumstances, factors like the size of the enterprise, the location of its activities, what the situation is in a particular country that they might be sourcing from, you know, the nature of the products or the services that they undertake and so on. So auditors are really focused on evaluating that due diligence is undertaken in good faith, that reasonable efforts are put in place, and they will be taking into account those circumstances. I've rolled out a program like this for the gold sector where at the Responsible Jewellery Council, where I was previously, where I think 60 or 70% of our members were SMEs under sort of EU size definitions. And this was something that they were certainly able to do. So I'm confident, you know, that the aluminium sector, which I think is in many ways more equipped to kind of put in place systems like this, will certainly be able to do it. And we are very active on developing resources to support all members, including SMEs. We're developing obviously some training ourselves, but as have been mentioned in some of the questions and in some of our answers, you know, there's the European Union have developed some due diligence toolbox and tools for SMEs as well that are general, presumably generally applicable and not just 3TG focused. The question of the lists is one thing, but the question of how you kind of set up due diligence systems, they are generalizable, and that's effectively the principle underlying the 5-step framework for OECD. So Camille, how long do you think it will take to implement due diligence, and how can people keep the cost down? Because, you know, that's an important consideration, particularly in the challenging times, COVID-wise, that we find ourselves now.
Yes, absolutely. So performing the due diligence will take some time and resources, but it's very difficult to say how long it will take because it really depends on your size, the position in the supply chain, the complexity and risk profile of the supply chains, also your experience in setting up management systems. So for example, if you have already developed some management systems for ASI certification or not. Then yeah, it depends a lot on the profile of your company. If you have few suppliers and long-lasting business relationships with them, you should be able to progressively accumulate the necessary information for adequate due diligence in a reasonable time frame. If you are a company with many suppliers, you might consider joining an industry association to combine forces with other companies and leverage more power. The level of detail and some example of what is expected at each step of the due diligence is explained in the guidance and in the training.
Great. And so one final, or maybe a couple of final quick questions before we wrap up. What's going to be the frequency of audits, Camille?
Well, it's the same as the normal process for ASI certification against the performance standards. The criterion 9.8 will be assessed at the same time as all the other criteria in the performance standard. So the audit frequency will follow the normal ASI assurance module. You can find the details in the assurance manual, but approximately every year there would be an audit, but depending on situations, of course. So the level of maturity of the entity, etc. And this falls under the same criteria as the other requirements of the performance standard. And Fiona, I have another question for you. Does the public reporting have to be in English?
No, it doesn't. So it can be the company language that you operate in the context of where you are and of course who your stakeholders are. So no, while ASI's sort of official language is English and audit reports come into us as English, you can do your public reporting in your language of choice. So with that, I think we're 1 minute away from our 45-minute session. And so I guess I wanted to sort of wrap up and conclude. I know it feels like a fair amount of work, but other commodity sectors have done it, and all the other commodity sectors that are trading on the LME will also be doing it in parallel with us. So, you know, copper, lead, zinc, nickel, tin obviously already is, cobalt is already sort of within the wings of OECD as well, but there's some big work that's being done by a lot of sectors on this. And so I think ASI and the aluminium industry can hopefully appreciate that that ASI is working to do this, incorporated into the ASI standard, provide that track A route for certainly for LME brands, but more broadly, doing the kind of work that increasingly stakeholders are expecting. I think we all know that human rights is a really key area for us to be focusing on into the medium to long term. So the kind of work that will start to be rolled out through the new version of the performance standard from next year is a really important step on that. And so we know there'll be lots of questions and situations that people want to explore with us, but we're putting a fair bit of effort into developing training and support for that process. So we look forward to you being on the journey with us in that space. So I want to thank everybody for joining us on the call and all the great questions. Thanks, Camille, for her preparation and Q&A session as well. We hope you'll join us for the next 45-minute session on next month, and we'll be sharing some more details on that as soon as it's ready. Thanks, everybody. Take care.